Bon matin, collègues. Bonne semaine. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais tout simplement confirmer que les tests de...
Good morning and have a good week. Before starting, I want to make sure that the tests have been carried out. So we're working on connecting with a witness. So we'll start with the other ones.
I'm sorry about that, but it is 11 o'clock.
I know,
Okay.
I know.
Alors,
So what are you talking on?
So I'm speaking about the fact that connection texts were made, and also I wished everyone a good Monday and a good week to everyone.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay,
Just-
we got Mr. Longfield. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
I just wondering if we can have an update on Minister Boisseneau?
I'd love to give
It's-
you one, actually.
it's,
He says probably in December.
Probably. It's
Yeah.
been over 20 days. He was supposed to be here last week
Yeah.
when the order came through, and why December? I think there's
I don't know.
people at Jasper.
But
Really?
he did. They say he's not available till December, so we're working on it. We want to get him here.
So
Yeah.
he's going to leave the people of Jasper just hanging for that long.
No, I don't think that's
And what
his
he's going to
intention,
do?
But yeah.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Well, yes, Mr. Longfield. No, Mr. Vancouverden. I'm sorry. Yes, Mr. Vancouverden.
This kind of language, thank you, Mr. Chair, this kind of language about a minister's availability, presupposing that the minister is leaving people hanging is not appropriate and is unbecoming of this
We
committee.
don't want to
Point of
impugn.
order.
We don't want to attribute motive.
So
or-
2,000 people are sitting homeless right now. I think it's a little bit of a priority, and some kind of language
Yeah.
should be used.
Okay, but I just think we don't want to attribute motive or impugn. But the fact is, we're working on it for December. That's the fact of the matter. Mr. Longfield, you still need to.
No, I'm looking forward to the
Okay.
testimony once we get there.
Okay, so, yeah, and I would like to do about 10 minutes of future business, not future business, but updates, housekeeping updates at the end of the meeting. So that was one thing I wanted to mention, so I'm glad you brought it up. So we will start, we're resuming our finance study for the witnesses who are appearing online. Please stay on mute if you're not answering a question or delivering your opening statements, and we're ready to roll. So we'll start with Mr. De Ariba Sellier, who is the Director, Erasmus Platform for Sustainable Value Creation, Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University. Mr. Ariba Sellier, you have 5 minutes for your opening statements. At 5 minutes, I will have to stop you, but it's not out of rudeness. It's just that those are the rules, and you'll still be able to get some of your points in later on in answering questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your invitation to appear before the committee to contribute to this study. I can only hope that other parliamentarians around the world will follow your example and take up this issue.
Basili, I work as a director of Erasmus Platforms for Sustainable Value Creation, as reminded by the chair, in the Netherlands, from where I join you today. I have a PhD from Leiden University and Erasmus University Rotterdam. Before my current position, I was a research director of Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance and a lecturer in financial law and policy at Yale University. Just probably somewhere south of where you stand. To introduce this testimony, I would like to recall a few facts. Since 2005, Canada reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 7%, well below other countries in Canada's peer group. Furthermore, Canada is not yet on track to uphold its legal commitment under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. In fact, Yale's Environmental Performance Index, the EPI, ranks Canada 166th in the world when it comes to projection of reaching net zero by 2050. In the meantime, climate change continues unabated, and the window for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is closing, as reminded by the United Nations no later than this weekend. Partly as a result, the Canadian financial system is highly exposed to climate risks, both physical and transition risks. I do not need to remind you of examples of physical risks that regularly and increasingly, in a most exponential way, threaten your constituents. Transition risks are also on the rise, regardless of what Canada decides to do or not. The Canadian economy and financial system is and will be influenced by external initiatives such as the US Inflation Reduction Act, the European Green Deal, policies of the People's Republic of China, which have rapidly made it the world's largest producer of renewable energy and electric vehicles. Solutions will not come from the market. Already in 2007, Lord Nicholas Stern, professor at the London School of Economics, rightly pointed out that climate change is a result of the greatest market failure the world has seen. ESG hype or not, the market has been incapable so far to address its own failure. This fact has been most recently evidenced by the so-called Big Five Canadian banks who, in spite of their net zero commitments, have increased their financing of fossil energy, unlike their European or US counterparts.
Solutions must therefore be dictated by public authorities, especially since it's the Canadian government that's bound by the Paris Agreement, not companies. As far as the financial sector is concerned, the first timid initiatives have been taken, such as the OSFI's guideline B15 on prudential supervision. I would like to come back to several initiatives that are underway. First, the sustainability reporting standards proposed by the CCNID say that it's vital to require greenhouse gas emissions, including in Scope 3, as their absence would distort the true carbon footprint of the companies concerned. There's a strong consensus on this, and the ISSB has unanimously adopted the standard at an international level. Are these standards sufficient in themselves? No, but they're a necessary first step, because you can't manage what you can't measure. We also need to ensure that the financial and sustainability information provided by companies is consistent. Next, the Canadian taxonomy. On the one hand, I would encourage you to take advantage of the reform of the Business Corporations Act to make taxonomy part of the publication requirements in order to assure transparency. This doesn't mean that all companies must follow the taxonomy, but that they must publish the extent to which they invest in activities aligned with the taxonomy. I also want to draw your attention to the importance of excluding fossil fuel activities, whatever they may be. Why? A taxonomy gives a signal to investors and companies about the economic activities that support the transition to carbon neutrality. Including fossil fuels would discredit the Canadian taxonomy as it did the European taxonomy with gas. I refer you to scientific conclusions of the IPCC. Every year counts, and fossil fuels are not part of the solution. Finally, Senator Rosa Galvez's bill on climate-friendly finance. I support this bill, and I invite this committee and the House to consider it as soon as parliamentary procedure allows. The legislation would move Canada decisively towards zero carbon and drastically reduce the transition risks to which the financial system and economy are exposed. In conclusion, I want to draw your attention to monetary policy, which is often the blind spot in these debates. As part of a whole-of-government strategy, monetary policy has a role to play. The Bank of Canada can, with its mandate, support the prevention and reduction of climate risks while supporting the transition to carbon neutrality. I would be happy to elaborate on these points and answer any other questions you may have. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Harry-Basellier. We will now pass to Mr. Keith Stewart, a Greenpeace Canada representative. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Stewart. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
I'm the Senior Energy Strategist of Greenpeace Canada and a sessional lecturer at the University of Toronto, where I teach a course on energy and environmental policy. I've been meeting with Canadian banks about their funding of fossil fuels since 2008. So if I seem a trifle impatient, it's because after the first decade or so of delay, a certain amount of frustration does set in. It's also been 9 years since Mark Carney gave his Tragedy of the Horizon speech on how the financial sector has a short-term focus built into how it operates, where 3 years is considered long-term. This structural myopia makes bankers largely blind to climate risks. Or worse, they can see the risks and have even begun to measure them, but their incentive structure doesn't allow them to respond appropriately, so we stumble towards disaster. This myopia can be overcome, but it will require elected officials to step in. This is not new terrain for governments, as we've been regulating banks to protect them from themselves since 1929. On climate change, the banks have been very clear. They are not going to be leaders. They are not going to do this on their own. We see it in their balance sheets. Canada's big five banks are still amongst the largest funders of fossil fuels in the world. According to a recent international report, they funneled more than $130 billion to fossil fuel companies in 2023 and over $1 trillion into oil, gas, and coal companies since the Paris Agreement was signed. That's $1 trillion dedicated to making the climate crisis worse, which dwarfs what the federal government has been spending to try and put out the climate fire. We also see their unwillingness to lead in their backing away from their net zero commitments in the face of an assault on ESG in the United States. They can claim to have the courage of their convictions, but those convictions seem to change whether they are writing to a Republican state treasurer in Texas about how much they support funding fossil fuels, or testifying before this committee last spring about how much they care about stopping climate change. We also see a lack of leadership in their lobbying efforts, which have sought to slow down the energy transition. They say they want an orderly transition, even as the greatest source of disorder is climate-fueled extreme weather that results in fires, floods, roads washed away, homes destroyed, and drought-stricken fields. Whether it is Jasper in July or Florida last month, the costs of inaction are all around us, and we should not look away. A wise woman once said that when someone tells you who they are, believe them. And banks are telling us that they are committed to follow, not lead on climate change. Yet financial regulation is still a missing piece in Canada's climate strategy. So we are here today asking you to once again save the bankers from themselves, and thereby help save the rest of us from climate chaos by using all of the regulatory and legislative tools at your disposal to align Canada's financial system with the Paris Climate Agreement. To this end, I join with my colleagues in the environmental movement to express our hope that your report will include recommendations to, first, keep fossil fuels out of any sustainable finance taxonomy. Second, develop regulations under existing law to require all federally regulated financial institutions and large federally regulated corporations to implement climate transition plans that align with the 1.5 degrees goal of the Paris Agreement. And third, support the adoption of comprehensive legislation such as Bill S-243, the Climate Aligned Finance Act. We recently saw some movement on the taxonomy that's under development. The taxonomy and disclosure rules are important, but as planned, they will only provide information that others can use to hopefully do the right thing. We need to stop hoping big money will do the right thing and make it mandatory for them to stop being a part of the problem and start becoming a big part of the climate solution. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Merci, Monsieur Stewart. On passe maintenant.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. We will now hear Maître Julien Beaulieu, a researcher at the Quebec Environmental Law Centre. You have the floor, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you. Good morning. I represent the Centre Québécois du droit de l'environnement, the only non-profit organization offering independent expertise in environmental law in Quebec. And today, I will be talking about the risks of greenwashing, which is a communication of false, misleading, or unsubstantiated information about environmental characteristics. Greenwashing is a major problem that prevents investors from making informed choices, that slows down the transition and erodes market confidence. Greenwashing can also destabilize the financial system, particularly by leading to hasty sales of financial assets. There are, unfortunately, significant risks of greenwashing in the Canadian financial sector. For example, several emerging financial instruments, such as green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, and voluntary carbon offsets, are not subject to any minimum content or procedural requirements. You've maybe heard about it, probably Bill C-59, adopted last June, represents a certain step forward in the fight against greenwashing. Since then, organizations have been required to provide evidence when making environmental claims. In other words, if you say you're green, you have to be able to prove it. That's good. However, these measures only apply to voluntary disclosure of environmental benefits. They may therefore not apply to certain claims, for example, those which concern environmental risks as opposed to environmental impacts. In addition, these measures do not require any disclosure of information to investors and don't impose a common vocabulary on how this information should be communicated. Finally, even though organizations are required to have evidence to support their claims, this evidence does not have to be publicly disclosed, thus making it more difficult to identify cases of greenwashing. A few days ago, the government announced 2 measures that could help improve the situation. First, the government announced that it will require large companies under federal jurisdiction to publicly disclose information concerning climate change, which will likely include some form of disclosure of these companies' greenhouse gas emissions. This is positive, but to make sure that it's effective, it has to be related to disclosing risks and impacts on the environment. Consumers, investors, and all want to know what the environmental impacts are of companies, and they want that information to be disclosed in a clear, standardized format. General rules of disclosure, which allow companies to occult or hide unfavorable information, must be removed. And also, this has to go beyond climatic issues. It has to include biodiversity, pollution, and mineral extraction. The second measure announced by the government a few days ago was the creation of an independent panel which will be responsible for developing financial taxonomy. This taxonomy, which won't be disclosed before a year, would create a system of classification and create official criteria so that a project can be classified as green or of transition. This also has great potential. However, in order for this taxonomy to achieve its objectives, 3 things are essential, and my colleague mentioned a few of them. It must to include credible criteria that are science-based, that don't give the green light to projects that will be harmful to the environment. It has to be mandatory to prevent the emergence of competitive taxonomies. And it has to have a governance structure that guarantees that its criteria are robust in the face of future political pressure. Once the taxonomy is adopted, and assuming that it will be a good taxonomy, it will have to be rapidly integrated into the regulatory ecosystem by making it a requirement for companies to talk about the objectives of taxonomy, etc. In order to complete these measures, we have to make these obligations more restrictive, more specific, and more comprehensive by converting these optional requirements into mandatory requirements. And in talking about impacts, not just risks, and including other information such as biodiversity, we also ask that the activity of the finance consumer activity of Canada to be enlarged, and also that carbon credits be regulated. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Beaulieu. And now it's Mr. Aswaf Damodarams, who's a professor at the Stern School of Business.
Statement. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to start from the perspective of what I'm not. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not an expert on banking. I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm not an academic researcher. I'm a dabbler. I dabble in lots of different things. And I've spent 40 plus years observing how businesses and investors behave. And what I've discovered is psychology and perception have a lot more effect on that behavior than economic models. So as an outsider, I'm going to give you my perspective on what I've seen happen around climate change. And this might not be diplomatic, but might as well cut to the chase. Here's what I've seen over the last 20 years. Climate change is the most publicized, the most warned about, and the most discussed existential crisis that I've ever seen. And you're saying that's merited, that's fine. Second, governments all over the world claim to care about climate change. In fact, every year they gather together in the most recent, the most recent meeting of COP28, hypocrisy runs rampant in this space, was said in Dubai. They talk about how they're going to change the world. They set targets that everybody knows will not be met. And I'll guarantee you there'll be a COP29, perhaps in Riyadh, where we will repeat the whole process again. Companies and businesses all claim to be green. They claim to care about the climate. And I'm going to gag the next time I see the words net zero in a company's financial statement, or an airline asking me to pay an extra $40 to see if I want to reduce my carbon footprint. And in this process, they've been aided and abetted by consultants and experts who fed them the buzzwords. And let's face it, ESG is an acronym. It doesn't even merit the notion of an idea or a concept. It's an acronym. Sustainability, just as much of an acronym. And these consultants have told these companies that they can have their cake and eat it too, that they can be green and be more valuable. Investors, same phenomenon. They pumped in trillions of dollars. Don't tell me enough money hasn't been invested in green spaces, trillions of dollars. And again, with the promise that they can deliver higher returns while being good. Consumers have been given lots of different ways in which they can show how wonderful they are. They can buy green products. They can invest in green funds. They can misbehave all day and come back home, buy an ESG fund, and say, I'm okay again. But here's, I think, the most sobering reality. After 20 years, trillions of dollars and all of this talk, if you look at how much of our energy comes from fossil fuels, it's barely budged. In fact, you know that our dependence on fossil fuels decreased more between 1975 and 1995 than it has in the last 20 years. And the reason for that was actually the one alternative energy source that most green energy people claim to hate, which is nuclear energy. Over the last 20 years, our dependence on fossil fuels has gone from 85% to 81.5%. We've reduced dependence by 3.5%, and we paid $10 trillion for that amazing fact. I'll let you do the math on that. If you really want to get the fossil fuel dependence down to 50%, you work out how much it'll cost. This notion that you can get good without sacrifice is the heart of why all of this space is in trouble. I'm not in any position to give you advice on what you should do with your banking, your pension funds, but I'll tell you what I think. I think you got to stop with this apocalyptic stuff. Do you really think telling people that the world will end in 35 years is going to make them behave better? That's like telling somebody they have 60 days to live and say, behave healthfully. It's not going to happen. So even if you believe that the world will end if climate change is not met, telling people that is the worst possible strategy psychologically. Second, remove virtue from this discussion. This notion that if you believe that climate change is before you're a good person, if you don't, you're a bad person. It's contaminating the discussion. It's making the perfect the enemy of the good. In fact, much of the research, and let's face it, much of the research on ESG and sustainability is not what the paper it's written on, but the research that actually takes a closer look has concluded that shades of gray are better than black and white, that investing in brown innovation is better than investing in green innovation, that accepting shades of gray is, I think, incremental change is going to be much more effective than this, hey, if you don't do this, we'll all die.
Okay, Professor Damodaran, this is a fascinating statement, and I think we're going to have a really good discussion today, but I have to stop you there so that we can go to questions and answers and explore these ideas in greater detail. So we'll start with Mr. Mazier for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Damodaran, my questions will be for you today. Are Canadian depositors at risk if the government mandates ESG ratings or climate-related disclosure statements on financial institutions?
It goes back to the heart of what I said, which is sacrifice is at the heart of being good. If you're going to ask banks to do something, you got to ask who's paying for it. Bankers are. It's not coming from bankers' personal wealth. The market cap of the 5 biggest Canadian banks collectively will be a drop in the ocean of the cost of meeting climate change. So if you ask banks to bear this cost, and what I hear when I hear that is you got to lend to green energy companies at below market rates. Because if it's at market rates, you don't need any of this stuff. If you can ask banks to do it, guess who's going to bear the cost? It's going to be depositors. Is that really what you want of this process? Acting like banks are these great, are like the big tech companies with hundreds of billions of dollars to throw around is delusional. So ultimately, if you put strictures on banks, the people who will pay this, and I can almost guarantee you this outcome, will not be bank shareholders, will not be bank managers, it'll be bank depositors.
Thank you.
I thought your role was to protect them.
Thank you. So sort of goes into my next question. What would be the impact to retirement savings if government forced climate-related disclosures on Canadian pension funds in an attempt to meet the Paris climate targets?
I'll be quite honest. I think I call this disclosure diarrhea. It's happening across the board. Companies, pension funds. You know what the net effect of all of this disclosure is? We get immune to it. We'll have 150 pages. And in fact, if you want truly ineffective legislation, pass more disclosure legislation. It'll actually make people even more immune to debate about climate change because you're going to throw the big stuff and the small stuff into that disclosure. And if in fact, pension funds are required to bear a cost, there again, you got to ask, is this the right group to be bearing that cost?
Will government regulation of ESG scores and climate change disclosure statements on financial institutions have any impact in reducing emissions?
Well, even the ESG services have no idea what ESG measures. ESG is the most diffuse, undefined, it's like nailing Jell-O to a wall. If ESG services have no idea what they're measuring, how the heck are governments going to require companies to follow ESG rules? It's a recipe for disaster again.
So would there'd be basically no way to reduce, or to measure the way how many emissions are being even reduced?
Well, they can disclose whatever they want, but if you look at the net effect, it doesn't seem to match up. In fact, if you collect up what companies claim they've done, and then you look at the output and say, why isn't it showing up in the results? There's many a slip in the cup and the lip. Disclosing this doesn't seem to show up in the final numbers. And I think that's a question we've got to ask is why, after 20 years of forcing companies to disclose this, and more so in the last few years, is nothing changing on the ground?
Thank you. You referred to an ESG gravy train in one of your presentations. Can you explain this term and explain how banks and consultants benefit the most from ESG scores and climate-related disclosures?
BlackRock was very much up in fronter in this ESG train early on. In fact, Larry Fink said the world will not be safe if we don't have ESG. So I took BlackRock's Sustainability Fund, which is a fund built around ESG, and I compared it to their regular fund. Out of the 500 stocks of the regular fund, 497 showed up in the Sustainability Fund. The difference was BlackRock charged 5 times more for the Sustainability Fund than the regular fund. You look at fund managers, you look at bankers, you look at consultants, every one of them has an ESG arm, and the ESG arm makes money by selling this notion to people. And again, with the idea that you can be good and be more valuable at the same time.
Thank you. Does improving ESG ratings or climate-related disclosures increase value or decrease risk in any proven way?
None that I can see of. I've heard, as I said, I've looked at every single research paper in this space. The papers that do are advocacy papers masquerading as research papers. I mean, I live in the value space. That's what I do. I value companies. I'm still to value a company where ESG has made the company more valuable. It can make it less valuable. But when ESG makes a company more valuable, it's because it's PR, it's marketing, at which point you're gaming the system. You're encouraging what you call greenwashing by pushing that idea on companies.
Thank you. You stated in the Financial Times, and I quote, "It serves ESG advocates to keep the definition amorphous since, like the socialists of the 20th centuries, whose response to every socialist failure was that their ideas had never been properly implemented, the defense against every ESG critic is that it is incorrectly defined or implemented, end quote. What did you mean by this?
You have 30 seconds, Professor.
I've had a lot of blowback on that one. The truth is that because ESG measures, you put 100 ESG people in a room, they come up with 100 different definitions. So whatever your critique is, they say, that's not my ESG you're critiquing. Very convenient, but not very, it's not very honest.
Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Ali for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Chair, I would be sharing my time with my colleague, Mr. Adam Van Koerden. My question is to Mr. Nathan. What are some global best policy practices that you can share for ensuring the private sector does business in a way that support climate and environmental goals?
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. And of course, I don't think in 5 minutes we have a time to go through all of them, if much. But what I would say is that well, I share some of the comments that were just made about the fact that ESG is a melting pot of anything and everything. For climate, climate is a real risk, and in this respect, you can see policies that actually can move a needle. For instance, the European Union just adopted the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which obliges every large company to have a net zero transition plan, and that can be powerful. I do believe that, for instance, there has been, and I alluded to that in my opening statements, the move towards disclosure regulation is welcome as long as sustainability disclosures are aligned on financial disclosures. And so, for instance, that companies cannot trumpet net zero commitments without them being reflected in actually their financial statements. In analogy to, I think, what Professor Damodaran was saying. And another policy that could be useful, for instance, is EU banking policy. EU banking regulation has recently been amended to require that banking directors have sufficient expertise on climate risks and climate change, as well as a transition plan and etc. And that can also be important and impactful.
Thank you. My next question is to Mr. Keith Stewart. Assuming our shared goals, the goal is to ensure the financial sector practices for climate and environmental goals. What do you see as the government's role in enabling this alignment?
Thank you for the question. So I would share some of the frustration that has been said about voluntary programs, where you're sort of asking people to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. What companies respond to are profit, motivation, and regulations, obeying the rules. And I think what we really need to do is have rules which shape the financial terrain in a way that we are actually investing in climate solutions. Because is there a cost to taking action on climate change? Yes. Is there a cost to not taking action on climate change? Absolutely. And so there are a variety of things which can be done under existing regulations. I think some of my colleagues have put forward detailed proposals on ways in which requiring net zero transition plans or climate transition plans for companies would help shape that. We have also sort of suggested things like changing capital risk requirements, imposing double materiality. There's a variety of tools that can be used by governments, and I think we have examples in the EU and other places that we can look to, but we really have to align where the money's going with where we need to be to protect people. And that's not happening right now because of this sort of obsession on short-term interests. And it's government's job to take that longer-term perspective and help shape the field so that we're all pulling in the same direction rather than sort of pouring all the money over here into things that are going to make the problem worse, fossil fuels. Well, the government is sort of like trying to like offset it with its own spending. We actually need to align private and public finance, and things like the Climate Aligned Finance Act, or is that the climate transition plans that we proposed. These are tools that can be used to really bring those two together, move in the same direction, accelerate the energy transition that's going to protect us from those climate risks, but also protect our economy from what Professor Sellier said was the transit risks. The risks of dropping oil demand in the world when oil is our number one export, which if we don't actually surf that wave properly, we will get crushed.
Thank you. How much time do I have, Chair?
About 45 seconds.
Can I pass it to Mr. Adam, please?
Thanks, Mr. Ali. I just have two really quick questions, Monsieur Darabia-Sellier. To the best of your knowledge, is there currently a Canadian law or regulation mandating that big banks say they are net zero?
No.
Okay, thank you. RBC and TD, all the big banks say that they will and would like to be net zero. Mr. Stewart, RBC is currently funding the oil sands to the tune of about $13.4 billion, and they have $43 billion in fossil fuels financing. Is that compatible with a net zero goal?
You have 10 seconds.
Short answer, no.
Okay.
We actually, Canadian banks are amongst the highest sort of funders of fossil fuels in terms of their ratios, and we need to turn that around.
Parfait.
So if they are saying one thing...
Monsieur Van Koevelen, c'est terminé. Madame Posé, à vous.
Madame Posé, thank you very much. To all our witnesses, Mr. Stewart, a lot of questions have been asked of you by my colleagues that I wanted to ask you, but there's one I'd like to ask you. You said, we know that Canadian banks refused to divest of fossil fuels. The Liberal government continues to provide millions of dollars as subsidies. So we can't help promises, but can we prevent banks from continuing to invest in the sector that's responsible for the climate crisis?
Rules that will shift that, that's the only way it's really going to shift. I mean, we also have a cultural issue in Canada. Like CIBC CEO likes to say oil is the family business in Canada. And Canadian banks are really tightly aligned with our own industry because it's a major export industry, and that also makes us uniquely vulnerable to the energy transition. So, sorry, I'll stop there.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. So, Mr. Beaulieu, I think that you're a specialist in greenwashing. We talked about it a lot in previous meetings. So would the taxonomy prevent funding oil and gas projects? No, not at all. And if we can ask the question, why are we hesitating so much to adopt it? It won't prevent anyone from investing in any sector of the economy. It's simply a label, and we let the markets decide where capitals will go. Do we want to invest in green projects, transitional projects? So we have to stop thinking that a taxonomy will solve all the problems. It has potential. It has positive effects because it makes the rules of the game clearer. So it solves a problem of coordination. Professor Damodaram talked about that. People use different words. So here everyone will be speaking the same language. When we talk about green, we know what it is, etc. And it can also solve problems of information in terms of disclosure if we make it mandatory for people to disclose things. But it does not prevent funding. But could it even favor greenwashing? Yes, it can. If we have an official definition that says, well, that's green when science says something else. There's a problem. We've just authorized it. So there are problems of credibility of a taxonomy that would authorize certain activities. And I think that we have to be cautious here. It will not prevent funding of activities that are not green or not transition, but at least we don't give them this additional label where they can have a green yum, and that would be associated with green bonds or something. In other meetings that we had on this topic, there are many people who came to speak to tell us that Canada still didn't have the taxonomy, and it exists just about everywhere on the planet. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating there. But Canada is really behind in this regard. So I wanted to know if, like my colleague, Mr. Van Couverden, was saying that, yes, it exists elsewhere. Could we not just copy and paste? So now they're saying, well, it's going to come out in a year. And I want to say we're in an urgent situation in terms of the climate. So is there a way to ensure that this reference framework will be used in practice and soon? Yes, but the problem here, a colleague was saying that if there's a committee that creates another committee that will adopt something, well, that's the risk, that it may take a long time and it will not lead to fruition. And then maybe even if it does, it may not be used. We don't want to create a dictionary that will be put on a shelf. We want a dictionary that will be used by financial institutions and people and everyone else. So taxonomy that's not used can't do anything. So we have to integrate it in the mandatory accountability things, in functioning of crown corporations that have to invest some of their capitals in some activities. So integrate this in accountability, in investment mandates. We can have mandatory disclosure for federal companies. They also have to disclose the number of their assets that correspond to the taxonomy. So it becomes transversal. Yes, there was a bill, Bill C-59, that was adopted in June on the Competition Act. Is that enough to fight against greenwashing? It's not sufficient for two reasons. First of all, it's only applicable to voluntary statements. A company that voluntarily says that it's green or sustainable has to give evidence to show that it's true, but others decide to not say anything, so no information is shared on the market that helps people make decisions. So there's no problem. There's still the problem of asymmetry of information. Second problem is that this requirement requires people to have evidence every time they make claims, if they claim to be green. But there's no obligation to disclose that evidence. So I can go see my financial advisor tomorrow morning and say, yes, here's a good ESG investment. And you just have to trust that they have evidence. They have to have evidence that it is the case. And I'm saying, yes, can I see that evidence? No. So why do these voluntary disclosure initiatives, why are they not enough? Well, we've reached 6 minutes, but maybe Mr. Beaulieu could insert the answer to this question in another intervention. Ms. Collins.
And thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today. And I in particular was appreciating Mr. Stewart and Mr. de Arriba-Sellier, your comments around the inclusion of fossil fuels in the taxonomy and what kind of danger that poses. And so really maybe to the two of you, and Mr. Stewart, starting with you, the government recently announced its framework for this much anticipated taxonomy. It definitely left the door open to the inclusion of fossil fuels. Can you talk a little bit about these dangers? And yeah, do you believe, like many others have said, that no taxonomy is better than one that includes fossil fuels?
Yeah, the devil is always in the detail. I think as Mr. Damodaran said, it's, if you get to make up your own definition of what's green, you're going to get a million definitions. And I would say, like with the taxonomy, it's important to remember that, this is not like saying you're not allowed to invest in fossil fuels ever. It's saying that if you're going to declare something is green, then we should have a high bar for that. And it's pretty clear that there's a strong debate within government and outside government over whether or not to include fossil fuels in that. For instance, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers argues that natural gas exports should be qualified as green because you might reduce coal emissions somewhere else. What we're saying is keep that bar high, have it aligned with 1.5 degrees, science-based alignment. I would say, like the IEA and the UN have both sort of put out guidelines on sort of how to actually manifest that. The UN high-level expert group on the net zero commitments of non-state entities actually has an Excel sheet that you can download, and like it's a checklist of these are the things that are compatible and these are the things that are not. And I think, a lot of that work's been done, but there's a political push to get fossil fuels in just because fossil fuels are a very powerful force in our politics. And we think, like, if you're going to be science-based, you should keep that out. And I think the government has punted this to a committee. So it'll a lot depend on what's the make of that committee. We're looking to that. But I would say, I would rather have no taxonomy than a bad one.
Thanks so much. And Mr. Doriba Sellier, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Similarly, you had talked about, how we need to exclude fossil fuels from this taxonomy and some of the dangers we've seen from some international examples. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for this question. There is a case I know very well. It's the EU taxonomy. It was supposed to be the early mover, the gold standard of taxonomies, they even said at the time. And the inclusion of gas in taxonomy, which has been a political necessity, perhaps, in the wake of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, led to this taxonomy being widely losing a lot of credibility in the investment community. And so I think it's very important that if you set a taxonomy, you respect certain number of criteria, and the EU taxonomy has some criteria that should be inspired, but maybe they should be a bit more respected. There is challenge before courts in the EU, for instance, that these criteria are set criteria that set criteria that are science-based. That there is a do no significant harm principle, i.e. any of the activities that are covered by the taxonomy cannot lead to significant harm to an environmental objective like climate change mitigation, and inclusion of fossil fuel will of course lead to significant harm to climate change mitigation, and also precautionary principle. I'm not sure whether precautionary principle is a principle under Canadian law, but I know that in many jurisdictions and under international law, it's a principle of law, and it is an important principle because there are some things we also can't really foresee. But for instance, for flaring, the effect of methane flaring has been documented for years, but it's come to light relatively recently how much devastating it was in terms of CO2 equivalents. And so that's important that all these three principles, I think, science-based, do no significant harm, and precautionary principle are respected in future Canadian taxonomy, if taxonomy varies.
And given the recent research showing, the increased emissions from gas, and especially the methane and its detrimental impact on our atmosphere and rising temperatures, I'm curious why you think, can you speak a little bit more about that kind of new research showing the comparison between, like, whether or not gas will actually displace coal, and if that's a kind of science-based claim that this is going to somehow reduce our greenhouse gases, and why you think the government is continuing to kind of leave the door open to this?
Well, I'm not a climate scientist, so I can't really speak on the science itself. Like you, I've read scientific studies, and supported by like in Nature Science, supported by the IPCC, which indeed show that gas may not be a transition activity like it was considered before. And even in EU taxonomy, actually, you have relatively strict criteria. To answer your question more directly, I think I would take back one of the points made by Professor Damodaran about psychology. If we set a taxonomy, it's a sort of green label, as I think Mr. Beaulieu said. And if we set a taxonomy like this, then of course, if we set a green label, everybody would want to have a green label, especially those who are undertaking a lot of greenwashing.
On doit s'arrêter là, malheureusement.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here. We'll be going through the second round. It will be shortened because of the time we still have. So we will have discussions for 3 minutes and 1.5 for the block and the NPD. Mr. Cram, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. I'll start with Professor Damodaran. Professor, in your opening statement, you talked about how our dependence on fossil fuels increased more from 1975 to 1995 than at any other time because of the adoption of nuclear energy. And you also spoke about I believe you used the term, the hypocrisy of environmental activists and their bias against nuclear energy. Can you explain why this bias may be there in the first place and what some of the benefits of adopting nuclear energy may be?
You're on mute, Professor.
Our dependence decreased because of nuclear energy. I think part of it is, again, this black and white of, you don't accept shades of gray. You are going to put things on one side of the line or the other. And for whatever reason, perhaps because of safety mostly, nuclear energy ended up on the wrong side of the line. And once you get on the wrong side of the line, there is no way back in this space.
de vous interrompre.
Excusez-moi, oui.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Chair. But in terms of nuclear energy, we're talking about sustainable finance. We already had 4 meetings. We have a report on nuclear energy. I don't know why we're coming back to nuclear energy today. They were talking about finance. Yes, but the subject is quite broad, I think. Broad enough so that we can include discussion on nuclear. We will continue. There are 2 minutes left.
Okay.
As I said, in a world of black and white, once you're on the wrong side of the line, there's no way back. And that, I think, is part of my problem, is purists end up putting one type of energy or the other on one side of the line, and we cut off any chance of compromise.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Professor, do companies that adopt ESG policies see higher rates of return compared to companies that do not?
No. In fact, the higher rates of return that high ESG companies have derived has come mostly from big tech companies early in the process being classified as good companies on the ESG space. It's got nothing to do with ESG. It's accidental alpha, as I call it.
And would it be the case that if companies that did adopt ESG policies did see higher rates of return, then all these companies would do it and there would be no need for this committee meeting today? Is that a fair assessment, Professor?
That's exactly right. If ESG and sustainability was so good for your bottom line, why the heck would you need it in the first place? They'd do it anyway.
And also, Professor, in your opening statement, you used the example of being asked to pay $40 to reduce your carbon footprint on a commercial airline ticket. What advice would you have for people the next time they're asked to pay that $40 to reduce their carbon footprint the next time they buy a commercial airline ticket?
You have 30 seconds, Professor.
You'd be out of your mind to pay it. I would not.
And can you elaborate on why that is, Professor?
Because that money might go into planting a tree in Oregon or it might go into somebody's pocket. I think that this is part of the gravy train that I talked about, all that money being collected with very little to show for it.
Merci, Madame Chatel.
Thank you. Madame Chatel. Thank you very much, Chair. Welcome to the witnesses. We had the opportunity of having economists from the OECD come to speak to us, several Canadian economists as well. They said that it's imperative that Canada act in the field of sustainable finance because it's an issue of international competitivity. So we see a flow of foreign capital go to countries that have adopted the taxonomy and the mandatory taxonomy and mandatory disclosure for large corporations. So I would like to understand what you think of the importance of the announcement made by the government on October 9th on the 2 major pillars of this green funding. So the taxonomy of green funding and transitional funding and the mandatory disclosure. So Mr. Beaulieu, well actually first I'll ask Mr. Harry-Bachelier, can you describe the benefits that such a taxonomy has brought to Europe on the economy of the countries and on the competitivity in this competition to attract foreign capital? Thank you very much. I think that the taxonomies, be they in Europe or elsewhere, provide an idea of the orientation of public policy to businesses. These taxonomies are support public policy. So in Europe, on the basis of the taxonomy, we developed other regulation on information disclosure, on the obligations of a duty of vigilance, on banks' obligations also, and in developing countries such as China and Brazil that also adopted taxonomies, what we see are there are monetary policies, there are fiscal policies, investment policies that use the taxonomy, and that can lead to a positive dynamic of investment and can not only support fighting climate change, but also support economic development. Thank you very much. So this is a positive factor, so we can meet our climate change policy objectives, and it's also positive for the economy. So it's a win-win situation for the economy and for the environment. Thank you very much. So we have we're up at 3 minutes. I'd like to quickly ask Mr. Beaulieu. There's no time left. No time at all? Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. Ms. Posey, you have 1.5 minutes, the time for a good question. You're muted. All right, but we'll go back to zero. Yes, yes. Thank you. So, Mr. Beaulieu, in terms of the voluntary carbon credits, are there risks of greenwashing in any voluntary disclosure? Well, that's interesting because we talked about it. We seem to have the answer. We should be able to buy these compensatory credits, and nobody can think that we'll solve the climate crisis, and any company can do anything it wants with those credits. But so there are credits for deforestation. So these carbon offsets can be very, very poor quality, and they can do all sorts of things. So thank you. I'll just stop you. I have a question for Mr. Stewart. What do we need to do so that Canadian banks be held responsible for the role that they're playing in fueling the climate crisis?
Climate transition plans that are aligned with 1.5 degrees. And I think, there's a variety of ways to do that. But that, I think, is key, because otherwise, I think they're going to continue with business as usual. And we've seen that since they announced their net zero commitments in 2021. We haven't seen major changes in how they behave.
Thank you. Ms. Collins, for 1.5 minutes.
Also to Mr. Stewart, earlier this month, it was reported that if Bay Street were a country, it would be the 5th biggest climate polluter in the world. These are shocking numbers, embarrassing for Canada, given that our banks are investing in fossil fuels at such high rates. Can you talk a little bit about the economic risks, the risks generally that you see in this news?
Yeah, so Canadian banks, pension funds, etc., are major investors in fossil fuels. And I think the risk is twofold. There's like the risk that involves with making climate change worse, and the physical impacts that come with that. We've seen that, if you look at all the destroyed infrastructure from these more extreme storms, etc. And then there is what, is called transition risk, which is if Canada keeps on the heavy investment in Canada and abroad of Canadian banks, insurers, etc., in fossil fuels, and the world successfully makes a turn away from fossil fuels, which is, for instance, what the IEA is saying is going to happen even with no new climate policies. We'll see a reduction in market for fossil fuels. We're left with a bunch of white elephants. And we're going to end up paying the cost for that. And we're going to end up having to clean up all of the old wells on public dime because the companies will go bankrupt. They're already very good at transferring those costs to us. that's a huge risk
Thank
for the
you.
rest of us as well.
Thanks very much. We'll go now to Mr. Deltel for 3 minutes.
For what? Combien de temps? 3 minutes. Très bien. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for this relevant information. Mr. Beaulieu, I would like to hear you speak. You talked about greenwashing, where people feel worthy, they present things, but we don't know what they're doing. So we don't know what businesses or individuals are doing. I'd like you to speak about the approach that many people have, organizations, individuals, businesses who travel by plane, they go to conferences elsewhere and come back, and then they buy carbon offsets to have a good conscience. I'd like to hear you speak how that relates to greenwashing. Thank you very much. It's a very good question because we see that more and more. I saw it at a trekking festival, so that bought all these credits, and they think that they're not polluting, but it was a very polluting event, so it greenwashes that event. So we can put measures to limit when these can be used and how. So we can define minimal conditions for the use of these credits. Here are all the minimal criteria to make sure that they're high quality credits, and we can limit in what context it can be used. So can we allow a aviation company to offer them? We can say that it's a good measure, but with the explanation that they're not making aviation a net zero activity. And so we have to define it. So in California, they've done something interesting. They created a law to make it mandatory for any company that uses or distributes these carbon credits to disclose how they're used and when they can be used. Canada could do the same thing. It could be amendments to the Competition Act, adopting regulation, or having a separate act, as California has done, to really set the criteria, because everyone says that these carbon offsets can pose a risk, a greenwashing risk. Do you hope that the government, when the environment minister goes to a foreign conference, it always buys the carbon credits? So do you think that we could recommend a virtual participation? I attend international COP meetings virtually. It costs nothing for accommodation and nothing for the environment, especially since I use an electric car to come to Ottawa. Could the government use stricter rules in terms of participation in events abroad? Or that the environmental costs are much higher? Very quickly, Mr. Beaulieu, I think we should all reduce our flights as much as possible. Perfect.
Mr. Van Koeverden for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start where I finished off with Mr. Beaulieu, if I could, on, there's been some confusion on this committee today, I feel, with respect to whether taxonomy would make mandatory or obligatory to all companies the adoption of environmental, social, and governance frameworks, or, if they would simply just have to be honest and forthcoming about the feasibility of their stated goals, as we've seen, them basically take these on as marketing. Could you clarify? Because Mr. Damodaran kind of implied as though the adoption of a taxonomy would make mandatory some of these commitments. Is that the case?
It's not the case. A taxonomy is just creating a label, and then if you want to issue a green bond, then everybody knows what should be in a green bond. If you want to issue a transition bond, then everybody knows what's a transition bond. Now, you might still want to issue a regular bond, a brown bond, or you can call it however you like. But at least for this specific category, we know what it means. Everybody agrees about the criteria that must be met, and that allows to avoid this disclosure diarrhea that Mr. Damodaran mentioned. So then we're sure that we're all playing by the same rules. We know what the words mean. And then if some people want to invest in green, good for them. If some people want to keep traditional investment strategies, well, not good for them maybe, but but they still have the opportunity to do it.
Thank you for that
anyway,
clarity.
it would be it would be like professional regulators anyway that would be regulating these bonds at the end of the day. So the taxonomy it cannot achieve that in its current framework.
Right, and just to be clear, they are currently saying that they're net zero or green or very environmentally sustainable, but there's no sort of ledger or like the taxonomy is the definition of those things, and with in the absence of that definition, they can be as dishonest as they'd like.
Yeah, so they might be making a 2,200 billion commitments to invest in sustainable projects, but it's up to them to define what sustainable means, and that's why you might be interested in defining sustainable as well, or coming up with other words, or at least requiring them to provide very, very specific information on what they mean when they say sustainable. And that brings me back to what I was saying about the Competition Act. Now, if you say that you're investing in sustainable, you need to have proof, but you're not required to disclose this proof. And if you require banks that say that they're sustainable to explain how and provide all the evidence, then you're providing an additional layer of transparency.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to table my motion that I brought to the committee's attention just recently on Bill C-73, which is an act respecting transparency and accountability in relation to certain commitments that Canada has made under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So if I could, I'll read it again for the committee. That to this end, the committee hold a minimum of 5 meetings, invite the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, as well as officials, and that this study begin within 7 days of the adoption of this motion.
Okay.
On
that, I'll thank the witnesses for their time. It was a very interesting discussion, very dynamic discussion, and it will help us greatly in the report that we produce. Thank you again, and you may, of course, disconnect and leave the meeting. Now, for the motion, is there agreement on this motion, or do we need to debate this? Or yeah,
Mr. Chair, I believe Mr. Van Koeverden said he was just tabling the motion but not moving it. Is that correct?
No. To be clear, sorry, Mr. Cram, sorry, Mr. Chair. I meant to say that I had tabled it before and I was moving it today.
Okay, so you're moving the motion, and is there anything more to say, Mr. Van Koeverden? We'll go to Madame Posé and Ms. Collins.
J'avais une question, Monsieur le Président.
Oui.
I have a question, Mr. Chair. It's more an amendment, what I hope is a friendly amendment. It's at the end of the motion of Mr. Van Koeverden. It says that this preliminary study must begin X number of days, I can't remember, afterwards. I would amend it to say that this study start once we have finished the meetings on sustainable finance. If I've understood, that would be the case. It seems to be drafted in such a way as to allow us to end those hearings. So we have 2 meetings next week. We have 2 meetings left. No, you're right. It might interrupt the hearings on finance. So I have a proposal, Chair, so that there are, in principle, 3 meetings left. Would there be a way to keep the original motion that the bloc tabled when we talked about the Minister of Finance, the Minister of the Environment? Would there be a way to have a table prepared by the clerk to say, here is what there was in that motion, here are the people that we have received in terms of witnesses, and so if there's only the Ministers of Finance and Environment, we could have a meeting next week with the ministers. Would that be possible? I would say that in principle, yes, but it's more complicated than that. For the ministers, and I was going to discuss this at the end of our meeting, but let's take this opportunity. For the ministers, we could invite them for next week, for both meetings next week. Of course, it's not certain that they'll be able to take part. So then we have to decide, do we postpone the next meetings on funding to try and find some dates when ministers can be with us? Or do we say, well, if the ministers can't be present next week for the two last meetings, we could invite their officials or and not have the ministers appear. So we have a discussion to have there. If, to my mind, if we want to finish our study on finance next week, Mr. Van Koeverden would have to accept that we wouldn't start the preliminary study before, what would it be? November 11th, but November 11th is, that week is off, so it would be November 18th. And we'd have to agree. We'll try our luck with both ministers for next week. If it doesn't work, we forget it, or we invite the officials. So I have Ms. Collins for the motion, but now we're talking about amendment. Mr. Van Koeverden, would you accept a friendly amendment that would allow us to end our study on finance next week? Mr. Van Koeverden.
Totally fine. That's the intention. I was just curious about the number of meetings left in sustainable finance prior to going over, any of the testimony. So presumably we have one on the 30th and then another one on the 4th. And did you say there's a third on the 6th?
We have all of next week is all of this week and all of next week is on sustainable finance, and then it's over. The hearings are over.
So I would just. Okay, great. I would just propose that we can just all agree that when we return, we're going to study C73.
Yeah, that's.
When we return.
Yeah. So we could say we could even take out B altogether, I guess, because we agree that we should start it, but we want to let the sustainable finance finish before we start it. Okay. Is everyone in agreement with that?
If it requires an amendment, then fine.
Sorry. What would be the first available after the commissioner? Okay. Some additional information. If we do that, we would start with this pre-study on the 18th of November. However, we would not be able to hear from the commissioner, who is scheduled for the 18th of November. So, sorry, I said is scheduled for the 18th of November. Sorry, I said is scheduled for the 18th of. Yeah, but she's talking to the main motion. I'll get back to her. This is like an amendment. We'll deal with the amendment and then. So.
I also have my hand up for the amendment.
Oh, that too? Okay. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Collins. I think we're going to. We may have to finish. I don't know if we're going to finish our second panel today, but anyway, go ahead with the amendment on the amendment, Ms. Collins.
Yeah, I think we just had a full day, like a full session of committee business where Mr. Van Koeverden could have brought this motion since he had tabled it in advance of that full day of committee business. I wish that we could do that so that we don't displace any of our really important witness testimony for today. But I guess from my perspective, I very much want to make sure that the nations from Fort Chipewyan have a study that.
Okay, I can come to that too. I can come to that too. So the Transport Committee has gotten back to us to say they will have a future business meeting and that they recognize, correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Clerk, but they recognize the importance of doing a study and they're going to look at the possibility of doing a study. So we don't have an answer on that right now.
So, and according to the motion that we passed, if they didn't get it back to us by today, saying that they were going to do a study, then we are planning on doing a study. So if there is an amendment being put forward to this pre-study on C73, and I very much support looking at C73 and tackling the big gaps in the legislation and strengthening the legislation on biodiversity accountability. But I want to make sure that that doesn't displace the important study on the contamination in Fort Chipewyan. So I would suggest it comes after.
Okay, who's next on the amendment? Yeah, Mr. Mazur.
Yeah, Ms. Collins brings up some really good points. We have lots on the docket. We have a minister that's not showing up on Jasper. We have to finish up the net zero accelerator. We got lots on the docket. And to Ms. Collins' point as well, I mean, we had a whole meeting that we could have brought this up, and I think we're just a little bit too busy. So I moved for adjournment of debate.
Okay, so can we vote on adjournment of debate?
Mr. Ali?
No.
Madame Chatel?
No.
Mr. Longfield?
No.
No.
Mr. Vancouverden?
No.
Monsieur Delta?
Oui.
Mr. Cram?
In favor?
Mr. Leslie?
Yes.
Mr. Mazer? Yes. Madame Posé?
Oui.
Ms. Collins?
Wait.
Okay, so we're not gonna.
Juste une chose, Monsieur le Président, je suis pas sûre que j'ai suivi.
Just one thing, Chair. I'm not sure. What I would like is to adjourn the debate to take it up again because we have these witnesses for sustainable funding. The debate is closed. It hasn't been suspended. It's closed. All right. We're not going to talk about it anymore today, and we'll move to the second panel.
Clarification?
Yeah.
If one of us moved it at the very end after we've heard from the witness.
Well, I think it's done
both-
now. It's done for the whole meeting, I think. It's adjourned for the whole meeting. So we're not, I don't think we can discuss it today. Correct? I mean, let me
think-
just check with the clerk.
Yeah, I think both Madame Posé and I were hoping that it could be talked about later on in the meeting after the witnesses.
Theoretically, we could, apparently, because we're changing subjects now, we're going to the witnesses. Theoretically, it could be, reintroduced?
Somebody could move a motion
Somebody could move a motion, but not this one.
to resume debate on this.
Oh, to resume, yeah, somebody could move a motion to resume debate on this after our next panel. That will take us till 1:20. And I mean, I've asked for extra time so that we can go to 1:30. I don't know, has it been granted? We don't know yet. So right now, we only have until 1:15. So why don't we do the panel, see what happens at 1:15 or 1:20? If we have more time, then somebody could move that. Yeah, we'll have to wait and see, I guess. That's what we'll have to do. So shall we proceed with the next panel? Because they're waiting. Yeah, okay. They have to be onboarded, so we're going to have to break. So let's break for a couple of minutes. Thank you. just had a little diversion there for a short period. So we have with us Professeur associé François Delorme,
Associate Professor François Delorme, who's appearing as an individual.
We have Professor Alex Edmonds, and we have the Canadian Bankers Association with us. I believe it's Brian Redesty, who will be delivering the opening statement. He is Director of Financial Stability. We'll start with Professor Delorme for 5 minutes, please.
Parfait. Alors, merci beaucoup.
Perfect. So thank you very much for the invitation to appear. I would like to start very briefly to talk about my background, which will help you better understand my evidence. So I worked 5 years at the OCDE and 5 years at the Department of Finance in Ottawa. I was chief economist for Industry Canada. And I can say that I observed how the system works from within, because I myself contributed to the functioning of the system, where the short-term private objectives have precedence over more long-term objectives aiming for the common good, such as climate change and aging population. So I stepped back and I concluded that more incisive public policy in terms of public policy and finance are important. I'll come back to that later. This fall, I'm teaching students 4 times a week. They're in their 20s. They're eco-anxious because of the progression of the negative effects of climate change. Last week, I gave a talk to Cégep students, young people that have 17 years old, that hardly have a voice in our institutions and are wondering why preceding generations, including mine, were not mobilizing in great numbers to take things in hand. The boomers have a huge debt to young people. They privatized rich wealth, and they and here's a more personal point of view as a background. I know that the committee is also aware that the GHGs increased by 1.3% in 2022. So we're not on the right pathway, which makes the situation much more dramatic to my mind in terms of what I said earlier. So the countdown now is starting in 2030, and that's what's most important. We have to change our public policy, and to affect this means of fighting climate change before 2030. It's very important. It has to be repeated constantly. So this is what I'm always highlighting in my public interventions and in the research that I'm doing on climate. Any person that has any notions of economy or finance knows that economy and finance are closely linked. So the savings in one feeds the investments of the other. But now these sustainable finance is just an oxymoron. Why? Because short-term finance is not compatible with the climate strategy. This has been showed by the work of Grandjean, Zignier Le Fournier, and Walgero in Europe in terms of green finance in the context of the free market. For a business to impose stricter environmental rules than others have would be a handicap in terms of competitiveness and costs. So it would just be fatal according to the current rules. The state must therefore do what it exists for, to guarantee the common good by legislating. Countries that have advanced in that regard will protect their assets. That's why Europe put in place the first phase of its carbon tax at the borders to correct the differences in regulation. The UK will do the same thing in 2027. So these are customs tariffs on carbon on goods that are imported that have high carbon intensity. New Zealand has done the same thing with an ambitious target, which would be 70 tons of CO2 by 2030, which is much lower than what others are giving us. It's a cost that should be much higher than that, given that that Canada already has a system that's a carbon pricing system that exists. We can use it and give us an advantage on our competitors that don't have a carbon pricing system that's comparable to the UE, the European Union, rather. The other thing I want to say very quickly, please, Professor Delorme, we've already reached 5 minutes, so I'll give you another 15 seconds. Another 15 seconds. So, in closing, we have to have verifiable criteria, and we did a study at University of Sherbrooke to say that our ESG criteria are not true criteria and are not verifiable, and we cannot follow them over time. Thank you. Madame Posé? I'm sorry. I was hearing Mr. Delorme, who is speaking French, but I'm hearing the English interpretation at the same time, even when I'm speaking now. I hear it. We'll try and find out and see what that might mean. So it's been solved. The problem's been solved. Thank you. Professor Delorme, you will have the opportunity to add your ideas when we move to question period.
Edmund, please, go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation for me to contribute to this very important topic. So from the outset, I should say I'm a strong ESG advocate. I understand the importance of taking ESG factors into account, both for society and also for long-term financial value. However, my views on this topic will be somewhat more nuanced, and I hope that these nuances will be of help to this committee. So the text of the motion refers to alignment with the Paris Agreement and promoting the reduction of inherent risks. It's important to be clear on what these risks are, because these could be risks to society, which we often call impact, or risks to the portfolio of a financial institution, which is often called dependency. And obviously, in many cases, these overlap, and a lot of my own research is on the overlap between what's good for society and what's good for shareholders. But they don't always overlap. And these trade-offs, it's important to be mindful of. For example, if there's limited government action, then investing in fossil fuels poses limited risk to your portfolio. In fact, boycotting fossil fuels could lead to more risk, even though this is a risk to wider society. And I also recognize that it mentions alignment with the Paris Agreement. However, there is evidence suggesting we might be going for 2.7 rather than 1.5, so it's not actually clear whether it's prudent to have a portfolio which will do well in a 1.5 scenario. So then the question is what should the objective be? Should we only take into account risk to the portfolio, or do we think that financial institutions have a moral or societal obligation to take into account risks to wider society? It's not clear. It's clearly not for me to say what the objective should be, but let me give some guidance as to what might be the implications of different objectives. So for a bank, which is part of the motion, banking institutions, they do need to be solvent for their depositors and also for wider society. Otherwise, losses could be leading to some pain on bailing out of banks. And it may well be that the investment lending decisions, which are good for climate change, might not actually be good for the portfolio. And if they were good for the portfolio, then as Professor de Modern was saying in the early session, why do we need regulation to encourage banks to take this into account? They would do this anyway. And why climate risk? Why not the risk of a cyber attack or a pandemic? There's lots of other material risks for a bank. For pension funds, which are also mentioned, again, it's not clear what the objective should be. The objective might be to maximize retirement income for pensioners. Now, for me as a pensioner, I actually don't have that as my objective. I invest in climate-conscious funds, but I can choose to sacrifice my return. I am able to afford it, but other people might not be able to, and so it may be that their objectives are purely financial. Now, let's say we do care about impact. We do want the objective to be more than just financial returns, but impact on wider society. It's not clear how we achieve this. So one view is divestment, and indeed net zero alignment or Paris alignment often refers to a portfolio which divests fossil fuels. But there's a lot of academic evidence suggesting that divestment, particularly in equity markets, has limited impact if you sell, somebody else buys, and given the fluidity and the liquidity of capital markets, the actual cost of capital impact is pretty small. Another view is engagement, but engagement in many times can be micromanagement. It might be investors who could be uninformed are imposing more one-size-fits-all rules on companies, whereas a company might be better placed to understand the risks that are most material to it. And finally, let's say that we do care about the impact on wider society. But the impact on wider society is more than just the impact on the environment. And I agree again with Professor Damodaran about the concerns of black and white thinking. I just got back from the World Economic Forum in Dubai when we were debating a just transition. And one woman from Africa got up and said, well, I'm from Africa. 600 million people do not have access to electricity. You are talking about just transition. 600 million of my citizens have nothing to transition from. Another person referred to a doctor in Sierra Leone where there was a power cut and babies died in a neonatal unit. So these are issues that maybe we in the West don't acknowledge. Maybe, given that the committee is in Canada, maybe the focus is on Canada, but we often view the West versus Africa in black and white terms. There might be people in Canada who have energy poverty. Now, this is absolutely not to say that climate change is not a serious issue. It is absolutely a serious issue. I've devoted a large part of my career to addressing this issue, but what I'm hopefully highlighting is some of the concerns and some of the difficult trade-offs which might come about of pursuing this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll go now to the Canadian Bankers Association with Mr. Brian Redzetzi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing. Pardon?
That's okay. Radisi.
Radisi. Okay, thank you, Mr. Radisi. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for inviting the Canadian Bankers Association to appear this afternoon to participate in the committee's study of the environment and climate impacts related to the Canadian financial system. My name is Brian Radisi, and I am Director of Financial Stability with the CBA. I'm joined today by Darren Hanna, Senior Vice President, Financial Stability and Banking Policy. The CBA represents more than 60 domestic and foreign banks, employing over 280,000 Canadians that help drive Canada's economic growth and prosperity. We advocate for public policies that contribute to a sound, thriving banking system to ensure Canadians can succeed in their financial goals. Climate change is a critical issue of our time, and banks in Canada are committed to doing their part to address it. Banks understand that the financial sector is central to securing an orderly transition to a low-carbon economy while also ensuring the continued resilience of our country's financial system. This includes working with clients across industries to help them decarbonize and pursue energy transition opportunities. By financing the climate transition, banks are helping Canada meet its net zero ambitions while also helping society meet interim energy demands in a volatile global context. Our 6 largest banks participated on the federal government's Sustainable Finance Action Council. We acknowledge the updates provided by the government earlier this month on plans for developing a Canadian taxonomy, and we look forward to further progress in this area. A taxonomy should provide greater clarity and certainty for businesses investing in new technologies and projects for the energy transition and for the financial institutions supporting them. Notably, even in the absence of a Canadian taxonomy, our largest banks have made commitments in the hundreds of billions of dollars. This is reinforced by the commitments made by our 6 largest Canadian banks as members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Our banks prepare and issue climate and sustainability reports on an annual basis with details on their emissions, targets, and progress towards achieving targets, along with information on their sustainable finance activities. Our banks are also engaged with regulators and standard setters, both domestically and internationally. Following the release of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision's Climate Principles in June of 2022, our Canadian banking regulator, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, finalized its Guideline B15 Climate Risk Management in March 2023. OSFI went a step further than the Basel Committee at the time by including a set of minimum mandatory climate-related financial disclosure expectations spanning governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. These disclosures are based on the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which our largest banks have been voluntarily implementing for a number of years. Our largest banks are now mandated to meet OSFI's disclosure expectations starting as of their 2024 fiscal year end, with our small and medium-sized banks being similarly obligated starting as of their 2025 fiscal year ends. At a broader level, the International Sustainability Standards Board set about developing standards that would create a global baseline of sustainability disclosures. The ISSB built on the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and published their inaugural standards in June of 2023, including a climate-related disclosure standard. OSFI has already incorporated this standard into Guideline B15 in March of this year. Importantly, the ISSB standards are intended for broader application across industry sectors, should they be adopted by national jurisdictions. While OSFI has already taken steps in this regard, it is also notable that a new Canadian Sustainability Standards Board was established and consulted earlier this year on their inaugural standards, which closely mirror the ISSB standards. We look forward to the CSSB finalizing its standards, which we hope will be adopted by other regulators and sectors across Canada. To this end, we also acknowledge the government's interest in mandating climate-related financial disclosures for large federally incorporated private companies and considering ways for small and medium-sized businesses to voluntarily release climate disclosures as well. Investors and analysts are looking for harmonized international disclosures that facilitate comparability. We are encouraged that Canadian regulators and standard setters are engaging with their peers internationally and are already in the process of adopting global baseline standards in Canada. A Canadian taxonomy will also be important in incentivizing greater levels of sustainable finance. Governments, regulators, standard setters, banks, and the private sector all have a role to play in taking concrete actions that support the energy transition in Canada. We believe it is important to recognize the progress that has been made to date, but acknowledge that more work remains to be done. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Radici. We'll go now to the first round. Mr. Cram for 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Radici, I would just like to follow up on what you said about the OSFI disclosures. Is it your understanding that climate reporting is already mandatory through the OSFI process? Is that correct?
Climate disclosures will become mandatory for our largest banks under OSFI's guideline effective over their 2024 fiscal year ends, and for our small and medium-sized banks starting with their 2025 fiscal year ends. But our largest banks have certainly been voluntarily disclosing their disclosures under the TCFD framework for a number of years as well.
Oh, okay, thank you for the clarification. I'd like to circle back to Professor Edmonds. Professor, you talked about the overlap between what is good for society and what is good for a company's shareholders. What advice could you offer policymakers so that governments are working in cooperation with the private sector to achieve both of these goals, which, as you indicated, may or may not overlap at any given time?
Thanks very much for the question. I think it's to forget about this ESG label. So I think the problem with ESG is it bandies everything under the ESG umbrella in the same way. But some of these things overlap and some of them don't, and it's important to consider them separately. So what is one thing where the impact in society comes back and benefits the company's profits? It's human capital. So some of my early work is on how treating your workers well ultimately leads to greater profits down the line. But that is something I call an internality. Even in the absence of government regulation, a company bears the consequences of its human capital investment. Something like climate change, that is an externality where you benefit wider society, you might benefit other companies, but it is costly if you're a fossil fuel company to reduce production significantly. And so those are the cases in which if you are to tell a company produce less or do this, then it may well be at the expense of financial returns. And remember, financial returns, they don't just go to nameless, faceless capitalists. They can go to pensioners. They could go to depositors if you're a bank. And so we do need to consider financial returns and when there are trade-offs to acknowledge them rather than thinking that everything was going to be a win-win.
Given that there can be so many positive and negative externalities and internalities, as you use that term, it would seem to me that it would be extremely complicated for a government to come up with a taxonomy system that could incorporate all of these different facets. Could you elaborate on if that could even be done, and if so, how?
I think it'd be extremely difficult to come up with a taxonomy. I'm not sure who is the supreme being to decide which things are material and which are not, and which ones to wait and which ones to not. And this is how ESG has become in such a problem, because certain industries, let's say defense, they were said to be bad and now they're said to be good because our weight on the different criteria will change over time. Most recently, I've joined the Sustainability Advisory Council of Novo Nordisk, which has come up with these weight loss drugs. And we've decided to send some of these drugs to developing countries, even though this leads to less revenue for us. Now, that is bad for our carbon footprint because it means shipping these drugs to developing countries, and yet there's a huge benefit in terms of reducing obesity. And actually, if you reduce obesity, then you can reduce climate change down the line, because if people don't develop diabetes, then they don't need to go to hospital for dialysis 3 times a week. So any taxonomy is typically going to be ignoring many of these criteria. It's really difficult to know where those bright line is to say what's good or what's bad. I would not like to be the regulator who claims that they have all of the knowledge to rule on these complicated issues.
Or perhaps, Professor, if you were the regulator, you would have a considerable amount of power and a considerable amount of job security. Would you agree that that may very well become the case?
It would be, and then I'd have a lot of power to decide, well, which companies succeed and which do not. So in the earlier session, somebody said, well, it's a taxonomy, it's just a description, it's value neutral. It is not value neutral. So I understand the EU taxonomy with Article 6 and 8 and 9 was supposed to be just descriptive, like blue, green, and red, and you want to invest in a blue, green, and red fund. This is not how things have gone. If you're an Article 9 fund, you're much more likely to get capital than Article 8 fund. And similarly here, if we classify certain activities as green, that will get more capital than the ones which are not with that classification. It may well be that companies spend lots of effort into ticking the box and getting the classification rather than doing the right thing. Actually, on some of my own research on a different topic, diversity, equity, inclusion, what I find is that demographic diversity, which often comes into taxonomies, has no relation to true equity and inclusion within the workforce, the inclusiveness of corporate culture. We can focus on the things that hit the taxonomy without actually creating value for wider society.
Professor, in your opening statement, you had some pretty stark examples from Africa and Sri Lanka about their climate change and global warming initiatives. What is the best way for developed countries like Canada and the UK to work with these underdeveloped countries, given that global warming is a global problem? And in particular, can you offer some suggestions of technologies that could be shared with the developing world?
We only have about 5 seconds left, so it might have to be an answer to a question later on. Madam
Chair, just understand these issues.
And you can also write to us and send us an answer in writing. It will be incorporated into the crafting of our report. Madame Châtel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Delorme.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Delorme, I smiled when you talked about your journey at the Department of Finance and at OECD. You seem to have had a journey that was similar to mine. And I'd like to say that we also had the pleasure of having at the committee, Mr. Miller from the OECD, who talked about progress at the OECD, and Mr. Usher also from the UN. And I'd like to discuss with you the idea of competitiveness of the Canadian economy on the international stage. I think it's important. My conservative colleagues often invoke the idea of abandoning our carbon pricing system, which would expose us to European tariffs on our exports, and also question sustainable finance, which would reduce our attractiveness to foreign investors. Could you talk about the potential consequences of inaction on in these two fields? You're muted. I'm sorry. Really? working on the short term as opposed to the long term. Yes, we could decide to end eco-fiscal measures to not hurt our competitiveness, but it will catch up to us at some point. The progress we won't have made in the next 3 to 5 years will have to be achieved later. But we can talk about this, but the climate doesn't care about what we decide or not. There will continue to be global warming, and the mitigation costs will increase. So we can maybe try to procrastinate and temporarily avoid problems in terms of competitiveness, but it's only to be hit much harder later on. Thank you very much. And could you also speak to us about the recent announcement by Canada in terms of green funding, of sustainable financing, and the impact on SMEs, because we have an economy that's largely based on SMEs. And I see that for mandatory disclosures, these businesses will not be covered. But are there measures? Because I'm afraid in terms of competitiveness of our small and medium enterprise businesses in this transition to a green finance, I want them to be competitive and draw investment on the medium term. I think that if the large businesses are subjected to stricter rules, there will be an effective emulation, and so the value chains will be involved, and all SMEs will be encouraged to adopt the measures for the larger companies. And I think it's a win-win situation for everyone. And we have to think about business with large, or trade with other countries and with our competitors. Can you speak about the competitiveness of Europe in relation to Canada's? We're 2 years behind Europe, and now we're adding another year to this. What is the risk involved in having waited so long to ascribe to sustainable funding? The risk is what I mentioned earlier, that we're just buying time. But that adjustment will have to be carried out, and the more we wait, the greater that adjustment will have to be. So on the short term, it can be defended, but in terms of the medium term and the long term, it's not a good decision. So we'll be suffering a little bit in the next few years in order to harvest the advantage, the benefit of our efforts. Is that right? That's what I believe, and I think the earlier we act, the better it is. Excellent. Do I still have some time, Mr. Chair? Perfect. So we talked about aligning various taxonomies. There will be a guide on the Canadian taxonomy, because that's good, and I think it's good because we have to have our own taxonomy, but there will have to be a coordination of the various taxonomies, be they European, Australian, or Canadian. What are your recommendations for international organizations that will be looking at this question? So I think that we have to accelerate our efforts to align the taxonomies, because we saw the G20 adopt a 15% minimum tax on large corporations and multinational organizations to level the field and to avoid tax evasion strategies. And also we have to do the same thing with green taxonomy. So that's an excellent project. Thank you. Ms. Luso, thank you. To all our witnesses, who have lent themselves to this exercise to understand these internal delays. Mr. Delorme, you are from the inside. You have seen what's been done within the government, and you said that it's very much a short-term project when we need long-term. So do we need a paradigm change in the economy and in finance? And if that's so, what changes? Yes, absolutely, because we can see the dynamic with which we exist now, which is emphasizing short-term yields and which can logically be defended in a short-term view. But climate upheavals are not something that takes place on a short-term scale. It's a long-term scale, because we're talking about heating to 1.5 warming by 2030, or 2050, but we're talking about, but we have to act at by 2030, and that's why I talked about the countdown in my speech. So it's very nice to talk about net zero in 2050, but that's not relevant in terms of public policy that needs to be implemented to change our trajectory in terms of global warming. We have here people representing the Canadian Association Bankers Association, but we also heard from bank CEOs. The motivation of big businesses and the banking sector is not to take care of or not to be concerned with global warming. It's not their main objective. They also don't take part in the fight against homelessness. So we have to force private businesses to really look at things in a much long-term horizon. And that's, I didn't mention it, but we did a study last year on ESG criteria, and we realized, first of all, that the ESG criteria are deficient in all companies, and so there's a great potential of greenwashing. And this is an economist speaking, saying that can we really measure progress in terms of E and S and G? And Mr. Edmonds talked about it in earlier. And so how do we conjugate these three apices of the triangle, and how can we follow progress? And when we look at that, we can see that for the everyday person, it's impossible with what we have now in financial reports to be able to give our blessing to large businesses and the banking sector that ESG criteria are solid criteria, robust criteria. Because when we talk about those, we kind of drape ourselves in that, but it's not solid enough yet. Mr. Edmonds mentioned that earlier as well. So you are for more prescriptive norms. Someone in the other panel said that businesses don't know what to measure in terms of ESG criteria. And the current requirements on disclosure has changed nothing in the field. It's not that we don't know what to measure, but even when we know what to measure, we don't know how to measure it properly so that it be comparable from one business to another. And did that company do better than another in terms of ESG? And that's important. So as far as you're concerned, you're saying that more constraints for financial institutions are important. Could you say what should be favored? Well, we have to document things clearly. We're having increased transparency. In that sense, S243 on funding aligned to climate would be something excellent in terms of disclosure, voluntary disclosure, but with a robust definition of the ESG criteria of the financial sector. Yes, we're referring to Senator Galvez's project, and we really need that in the Canadian government. Why, more specifically? Is the senator's bill sufficient, or could it go further? We can't be against virtue, but it's certainly going in the right direction. So earlier we also spoke about having objectives of 1.5 degrees centigrade, the Paris Accord objectives. And in terms of banks, how can we make sure that they transfer their funds from fossil fuel industry to renewable energy sources. Is there a way of making sure they're doing it? Well, we have to find a way of making sure that green investment becomes more profitable than brown investments. So we have to find ways where there's a logic of the market ensures that banks can have advantages there. So should there be tax credits? Do we have to limit access to brown assets? But we have to facilitate that transition, because we can think that the financial milieu might do it itself, but it would just take too long. Thank you. You have 4 seconds left. Ms. Collins.
Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. I wanted to pick up on with Mr. Delorme and kind of to dig in a little bit more to transition plans. You've spoken a bit about how these voluntary pledges that financial institutions are making may not be sufficient. Can you elaborate for the committee kind of what a climate transition plan is, why they're so important, why this goes farther than what's happening right now?
Bien, je pense que la première chose, c'est d'avoir plus de transparence sur les plans de transition.
The first thing is to have more transparency during transition plans and to have criteria for disclosures. They need to be more clear. And we're also talking about new rules that are going to be new rules from OSFI. But my point is that we need to do this faster. We can't keep voluntary disclosures. We need to force institutions to adopt rules that are more transparent, but we won't be able to reach our goals otherwise. It's a matter of speed. It's not, well, what we need to do now actually is to take bigger steps.
And having stronger constraints will allow us to accelerate this transition.
And can you talk a little bit about how other countries are legally requiring these things, and a bit more about what risks Canada's financial systems faces in terms of international competitiveness, when it fails to have these kind of proper climate-aligned financial regulations in place, and just how we compare generally?
Bien, je ne suis pas un spécialiste de la taxonomie.
I'm not a specialist in green taxonomy, but we have to go further. We have to have an independent organization like what is in place in the UK in order to assess the credibility of measures that are put into place for the transition. And as Ms. Posé said, Canada is several years behind compared to Europe. So we absolutely have to do this quickly. And maybe, as I said, the OSFI rules are a step in the right direction, but there should be more independence or more of a distance in the financial world by creating an independent organization such as what they do in the UK.
Heard from other witnesses in other panels in this study was that there are conflicts of interest where fossil fuel directors also serve on the board of financial institutions. In your opinion, does this pose a governance problem, especially when we heard that 1 in 5 bank directors have an explicit connection to fossil fuel companies?
Je ne peux répondre que par un mot, et c'est oui.
One would answer yes.
Mr. Chair, how long do I have?
About 2.5 minutes.
Great. Mr. Edmonds, you recently published a paper, and you kind of restated this in some of your testimony today, that there are very few equity portfolio managers who are willing to sacrifice financial returns for environmental sustainable performance, largely due to fiduciary duty concerns. And voting and engagement are mainly driven by financial considerations. Given what you've kind of outlined for the committee today, can you talk a little bit about the package of regulations you'd want to see from government that would incentivize climate-aligned financial decisions instead of more polluting sectors?
Yeah, certainly. It's not clear that regulation would address the issue. So you're absolutely right that that's what we found is the current status quo. Asset managers are not going to be taking into account issues they don't believe are material. However, what can lead them to doing this is constraints from their own clients. So if there's a fund mandate saying you have to invest in sector X, you're not allowed to invest in sector Y, that is something which absolutely can move them to investing in a different way. But that will come from the clients of those funds, not necessarily from regulation. What might be the issue of having it regulation do it? It will go back to the discussion of taxonomies previously. It's very difficult to decide, well, what is good or what is not good. Maybe a client can decide for themselves, but I'd be rather nervous about a regulator deciding on behalf of all clients. That has happened actually for my industry of education. So a while ago, you had No Child Left Behind in the US, where they said, let's try to have a taxonomy and measure which schools are good and which ones are bad, to allocate capital to the well-performing schools and away from the poorly performing schools, just like the idea of allocating capital towards the transition. But this then led to many schools teaching to the test. And I think when you have such a complex issue where there's so many moving parts, it is quite difficult for regulators to have a taxonomy which takes these all into account. So what I'd say is that it's incumbent on the clients to express their wishes or in fund mandates in order to guide investors on where they should be allocating their capital.
Just 15 seconds, yeah, 15 seconds.
Okay, well, I will see that time and I'll pick it up in the next.
Committee thanks you. Committee thanks you. Mr. Mazur, we'll make this a 3-minute round as well.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Edmonds, if Canadian pension funds divest from oil and gas, will this have any impact to reducing emissions, or will it only move capital from one beneficiary to the other?
Unfortunately, it will do the latter. So what it will mean is that you can only sell if somebody else buys. We think of it like a boycott, like a customer boycott. So if I don't buy products, they're going to stay on the shelves. But that is not true in capital markets. You can only sell if there's a buyer. And in fact, it may well mean that the buyer is somebody who cares less about climate change than you because they're willing to buy those stocks. So you actually no longer have a seat at the table to engage. So not only do you lose the higher returns from carbon, unfortunately, I wish this was not the case, but unfortunately evidence is that emitting firms earn higher returns, perhaps because this is an externality, not an internality. You not only lose that, but you also lose your ability to engage with these companies.
What would be the impact to retirement savings if the government forced climate-related disclosures on Canadian pension funds in an attempt to meet Paris climate targets?
It's not clear to me what the goal of disclosures are to begin with. It's like saying, well, the best way to lose weight is to have more accurate scales. No, it's actually to take real action here. So it seems we're all about disclosures and taxonomy, but this can lead to you taking action in order to beat whatever taxonomy that there is here. So it's not clear that it will have any positive impact, and yet you're going to have to put a lot of effort into disclosing. For example, Unilever, I believe, is having to hire 10 people for the next 5 years to just disclose information. Not actually to do anything, but to disclose what they're doing. So this is something where there's a direct cost of disclosure, and then the indirect cost might be that you focus on the measures that are being disclosed rather than actually creating value, as I mentioned in my diversity comment earlier.
Will a government regulation of ESG scores and climate change disclosure statements on financial institutions have any impact in reducing emissions?
Well, before you have a regulation, you need to think, what is the problem to which regulation is a solution? So you might think, okay, ratings here, we need to regulate them because they disagree with each other, and that's bad. What is another word for disagreement? It's diversity. We can have legitimately different opinions on the ESG of a company. As we've discussed, there's so many complex issues here that it's hard to say what's green or brown. It's actually fine for ratings to disagree, just like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley might disagree as to whether a company is a buy or sell. So I'm not clear what regulation would achieve in that place, in that instance, because it's not clear what the problem is to which regulation is a solution.
So there's really no clear answer to reducing emissions.
Sir? There is a clear answer, which is there's not going to be a clear positive effect.
Okay, we're pretty much done. So we'll go to Mr. Longfield for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to start off with with Mr. Rajitsi. In terms of Canada's positioning in the international banking system, Canada has been very respected for our system of regulations in the banking industry, but we're not being as well recognized for our ability to apply externalities to the banking system in terms of sustainable finance. If we're not able to correct the ship there, what's the impact on the Canadian banking industry?
I would say that our banks, our largest banks, were happy to participate in the federal government's Sustainable Finance Action Council, and we did a lot of good work collaboratively to produce an initial taxonomy roadmap report. The government gave the updates earlier this month that they're looking to make further progress. So I think that's one form by which our banks are active participants in supporting sustainable finance activities in Canada.
And I think participating on the Action Council was very important, and I think really sent a clear message in terms of the commitment of the banking industry towards sustainable finance, but also in terms of the government's commitment to getting it right. What's the risk if we get it wrong?
I think we obviously want to support the energy transition in Canada. We're doing all we can to work closely with our clients. Our largest banks, some of their initial targets were focused on the oil and gas sector. They're continuing to work towards progress towards achieving those targets. So it's hard to answer that question. I'm not a climatologist in terms of what could go wrong, but obviously there could be serious consequences, and our banks are doing everything we can, whether it's through the SFAC, whether it's complying with OSCE regulations, to ensure a good energy transition in Canada.
And I think in terms of the business of this discussion, I mean, I was managing director of a firm in Canada that was UK-centered. We were operating in various countries around the world. Canadian banks are also operating in various jurisdictions, including the EU. What's the pressure on compliance for Canadian banks operating in other countries and then transferring compliance to Canada?
We definitely are work to be in adherence with the regulations around the world on which our banks operate. Definitely the EU has their own corporate sustainability reporting directive that may impact some of our banks. So we're definitely making sure we're going to be compliant with that directive for those banks to which it will apply. I would also say at an international level, the International Sustainability Standards Board that I mentioned in my opening remarks has done a mapping to those European sustainable reporting standards. So that will be helpful for our banks that are impacted to understand how they need to comply with them.
Trying to close the door on this is it's an impossible thing because we are in a global market and have to react to global winds of change.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Time's up. Thank you very much. Madame Posé, 1 minute et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Ms. Posé, 1.5 minutes.
Vous êtes en sourdine, madame.
You're on mute.
On repart le compteur à zéro, Monsieur le Président.
Can we start the clock again? Thank you. I'm not sure, Mr. Delorme, if I understood correctly what the other witness said, that if we reduced emissions, it wouldn't have a clear effect. I'm not sure I understood that, but I'd like to talk about the cost of failing to act when it comes to climate change. Well, it's a very important question because the cost of failing to act, according to all the studies, that's going to cost much more than doing something. So you can have a carbon tax that may reduce economic activity by 0.1 or 0.2% in the short term. But studies since 2006 show us that inaction could cost us 10 to 15% of the GDP in the midterm. So I come back to my previous comment. We can add time, but it's going to catch up to us. It's like prevention in a medical situation. Saying, okay, I'm not going to see the doctor, I'm not going, and then when you finally go, the doctor says, well, you should have come last year. Your time is up, Ms. Posé.
Maybe to Mr. Delorme, you talked a little bit about your support for the Climate Aligned Finance Act. This has had endorsements from hundreds of academics, civil society groups, climate experts, and really, hits on a lot of the themes that you've been talking about when it comes to holding corporate directors to account for climate action, mandating climate action plans from financial institutions, ensuring there's no climate-related conflicts of interest on boards. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important for this bill to go forward, this kind of legislation?
Je pense que c'est important parce que
I think it's important because it's part of multiple efforts that will allow us to succeed in fighting climate change. You can't just take isolated action to try to solve this problem. And I think where we are today, and I say this for the fourth time, 2030 is really the beginning of the countdown. It's essential to bring all of these initiatives together, and everything that you've mentioned in terms of green initiatives will allow us to make these initiatives work together.
Monsieur Deltel, 3 minutes.
Mr. Deltel, 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Darren Anna. A little earlier, Mr. Julien Beaulieu questioned the idea of having a voluntary disclosure. He suggested there should be a mandatory disclosure so that we can determine if targets are actually met. I'd like to hear your opinion. Earlier on, someone mentioned that voluntary disclosure is just as efficient because when you do it voluntarily, you're even more engaged, really. So I'd like to hear your opinion on that matter when it comes to actions that are made when you're investing in green businesses.
I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Mr. Radici, who is our lead witness and can speak to that.
So I would answer that the banks are setting targets, net zero targets, and they have to track progress against those targets. It has been voluntary up until this point. The banks, our largest banks, have adopted the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations, which include that scope, but now they will also be mandated under OSFI's guideline B15 to also disclose that information. So definitely they're doing it on a voluntary basis already. It will become mandated for all the banks in Canada. As I said in my opening remarks, starting 2024 fiscal year end for the largest banks, and then 2025 fiscal year end for the small and medium-sized banks.
Et qu'avez-vous à dire à ceux qui estiment que
And what do you say to those who say that you have to have the same assessment on investments? And how are you able to specifically measure investments that are dark green, medium green, or light green, or businesses that are making an effort but don't have a specific registry and specific information on their footprint?
So that's where, again, I would go back to the Sustainable Finance Action Council, and we look forward to the government's further progress on their work, where the initial taxonomy roadmap did delineate between both green and transition eligible investments in Canada. I think it's a little bit different than other jurisdictions, such as Europe, which just has a green taxonomy. Obviously, Canada is a resource-based economy, so I think the addition of a transitional eligible component is also an important and innovative step that Canada has made as part of the participants on that Action Council.
Thank you. Time's up. We'll go to Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Professor Edmond, I have a question for you. You have been repeating often in response to questions that you need to leave it up to the consumer or the client to make choices about where they invest. And to that end, a taxonomy and reporting and disclosure requirements provide information to consumers, to investors, as well as some consistency and simplicity, because not all investors can read through the reports and figure this all out. If people are going to make true choices and clear choices about what they want to invest in, do you believe that this kind of disclosure, transparency disclosure in these taxonomies that simplify how an investor can look at these companies' investments is necessary?
Thanks very much for the question. Yes, I agree that it simplifies it, but I think it makes it too simplistic. For example, if you're an investor, you'd like to invest with good CEOs and not invest with bad CEOs. Should we have a taxonomy saying which CEOs are good or bad, or which companies are good or bad?
Could I just interrupt for a moment? Because I realize there's many, many other issues than simply climate change, but I'm focused on climate change. If I'm an investor looking, and one of my priorities is to ensure that my investments are made in green, quote unquote, however it's defined by the taxonomy, companies, shouldn't we be able to have some kind of a way that I and other investors could actually determine if these investments are green?
Yeah, I did understand the original question, and so why I gave that analogy is just as it's very difficult to understand whether a CEO is good or bad, it's really difficult to classify a company as green or not green. There's a lot of second and third order effects here, and it may well be that consumers go with this particular label because they think something is green, when actually there's lots of second and third order effects which mean that it's not green. So yes, it does make things simple, and this is why there's a lot of attraction. It means that you can just simply...
Okay, I'm sorry, I only have 3 minutes because it's the last round, so I don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to understand then. So it is complex, it's difficult to do. So are you suggesting then that we don't do anything, we just let consumers do the best they can to figure it out?
No, we don't. So there is already a big incentive for companies and asset managers to disclose information, because these are things that consumers think is relevant. However, what is complicated is the information that is relevant will vary from company to company. So the problem with standards is that they will be generally quite generic, whereas the particular way in which one company impacts on climate change will be different from company to company.
But certainly, excuse me again, because this is something you've been saying, but I just don't understand if we're leaving it voluntary, we're letting companies do it the way they want.
It's not the way they want, it's the way that people want companies to disclose, because companies respond.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to suspend this debate. Time is up. To the committee members, we will be reaching out to the two ministers, and hopefully we'll have an answer by tomorrow. We'll be able to report back on Wednesday. With
Chair,
that,
point of order.
Yes.
I just wondered if we had heard anything from Mr. Carney as far as coming for witness?
He won't be able to make it.
At all?
No, because I'll tell you the dates we proposed. May 7th, he couldn't because he was chairing a meeting outside Canada. August 2024, Mr. Carney expressed an interest in appearing in October or November, but a date was not confirmed. Then we looked at October 30th. Mr. Carney is committed to speaking at an event and sends his regrets. For the week of November 4th, Mr. Carney will be traveling that week due to his schedule leading up to and following COP 29. It seems he will be unavailable to participate this year. So with that, I will adjourn the meeting.